Well, I'm Andrés, QualityComputing.com. I'm also one of the researchers in the Qualia Research Institute. And if you're interested about that, definitely come talk to me. There's some things cooking on the way in that front. And I want to say that I'm really grateful to be here. I love consciousness hacking. It's like a wonderful community. I find it fascinating to blend spirituality and technology and first-person experience and exploration into something that, well, it's really the next stage of human evolution. Let's start with a simple question. What's the meaning of life? Okay, so just to kind of like put it out there where I'm coming from, I think like just to guide us, I think of it in terms of there's two facets. On the one hand, you have to understand the universe. Like hopefully part of the meaning of life is to make sense of reality. And then on the other part is to be happy and make others happy. And I've got to confess that at least for half of my life, I really just thought the meaning of life was number one. Like, almost like happiness was kind of some kind of distraction. And really the whole, like my whole purpose was to just have a hyper-rational description of the universe, and that's it. But then, like, as a teenager, reading philosophy, I was introduced to meditation, experimenting with psychedelics and things like that kind of made me realize, well, actually, we have a very poor understanding of consciousness and even poorer understanding of happiness and the meaning of like intense bliss. And I thought, hey, like actually, this goal just like opened up to my life. I had kind of like this expansive experience about that. And I think really these two things are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they can be seamlessly combined. On the one hand, to understand the universe will allow you to understand the nature of happiness and bliss. And as well, if you're able to be happy and make other people happy, you will remain motivated to be able to investigate the nature of reality. So they feed off each other. They should be thought of as symbiotic rather than in opposition. And this brings to the forefront kind of the question of what makes an experience valuable. And I think the way in which I approach it is to basically ask the following three questions. If I have an experience or somebody describes me of an experience that they consider very valuable is, okay, how do they fare in these three dimensions? Does it feel good? I think that's an important component. The second is, does it make you productive? And in a good way. And by that I mean, does it further your values? Does it allow you to pursue what you care about? And thirdly, does it make you ethical and caring and compassionate and loving for other people? And I think like good experiences, or the ones that we should value as highly valuable, are those that satisfy all of these three things at once. And at some point, I might delve like much deeper into that. But for tonight, I'm actually going to focus on the first component, trying to find a scientific and ultimately like completely coherent way of identifying what makes an experience pleasant. What makes an experience feel good, ecstatic, blissful, amazing. And to kind of like put this into some context, I'm just going to briefly mention kind of like the kind of standard way in which in neuroscience and psychology they tend to divide emotions, which is along these two dimensions. You have on the one hand valence, which is how good the experience feels. And on the other hand, you have arousal, which is how much energy you have. So for example, like excitement is a high arousal, high valence state, whereas serenity or peacefulness is a low arousal, but still high valence state. Depression would be low valence, but low arousal, and anxiety and anger is high arousal, low valence. But then you will also come to the conclusion that there's like a lot of emotions that can be placed pretty much in exactly the same point in that two-dimensional space. And yet the raw experiential texture of those emotions are very different. So emotions and states of consciousness have a lot, there's a lot more to them in terms of like structure and feeling and experiential character than you get from just valence and arousal. This is briefly a graph of like 175 emotions and the transition probabilities between them. And I think it kind of like captures a little bit kind of the fine-grained structure of emotion. There's like a lot of it in there. Things that may feel from a broad perspective somewhat similar, really they have like some subtle differences that ultimately affect our behavior or the way we perceive the world. And so this kind of puts to the forefront the question, so what is bliss? How is it possible there could be so many different experiences with all of them being very rewarding that we regard as very valuable, and yet have different textures. So what is it that underlies the similarities of all the experiences that are worthwhile in the sense of feeling good? And there's like obviously many accounts for trying to answer this. You have kind of people who believe that it's kind of some kind of a spiritual signal, that basically when you have a holistic feeling of well-being, that's some kind of a higher entity telling you that you're on the right path, for example. And other people might say, hey, it's just chemical reactions in your brain, don't worry about it. Other people might say, wait, it's activations in the pleasure center. But if you notice, all of these accounts are really just saying how bliss behaves and under what conditions it gets triggered. It's not telling what exactly it is. It's very similar to if you just look at, for example, an electron. You might look at the equations and see how it behaves in different contexts. But that doesn't allow you to see what exactly is an electron in a deeper sense, what it truly is. And the last option here is basically trying to get at that, is maybe that symmetry and consciousness have something to do with when it comes to bliss. My colleagues and I in the Quillia Research Institute have been basically working out a fundamental theory of valence, the pleasure-pain axis, where symmetry is at the core of it. And there's kind of like this just one bit of formalism that I think it's important to put out, and that is that just as through the history of science, it has been very beneficial to postulate that for any weird phenomena that you look at, there might be a mathematical object such that the properties of that object correspond to the properties of the phenomena you're studying. Likewise, we postulate there exists a mathematical object such that the mathematical properties of it map into the properties of any experience that you may care about. So we call these the symmetry theory of valence. And it would have like more or less the following components. So the first one is that consciousness is real and it's a measurable thing. It's actually like, it truly exists. I mean, there's a lot of, it's fashionable nowadays in neuroscience and cognitive science to think of consciousness as some sort of illusion. We say no. Actually, consciousness is definitely real. It's a part of reality. It's important as well to kind of here realize that symmetry has a very deep connection with harmony. In a sense, harmony is symmetry over time. So we would kind of explain why harmonic sounds, for example, sound good, or harmonic stimulation through visual experience also can feel really good, precisely because there is symmetry over time. And like the key component here would be still symmetry. Then the pleasure centers, in this interpretation, they work as tuning knobs for harmonic patterns. So it's not that if you look into the pleasure centers themselves, you will find some kind of the essence of pleasure, like in the proteins expressed in the very pleasure centers. It's more that as a system in the entire brain, the pleasure centers are strategically positioned really at the center of it all, such that by changing very slightly that activity, you can modulate the whole harmonic patterns in the entire brain. So they're like very strategically positioned to do that. Boredom would be some kind of mechanism in the brain that creates anti-symmetry. So if you listen to a song, sure, it could be very harmonious, it could be very beautiful. But if you listen to it 1,000 times, eventually you get bored. It's like, hey, what's up? Didn't you say that pleasure had to do with symmetry? I'm still listening to the song and it's still symmetrical, but I don't feel it anymore. And what we would say here is actually, well, your brain kicked in this mechanism to introduce noise or dissonance when you experience that music, because it's actually just something you thoroughly know. So basically, there's like these inbuilt mechanisms that disturb the symmetry whenever things get boring. It's also important to say that the interpretation here of like the effect of various drugs, especially anything that makes you feel good, is that they're changing the neuroacoustics of your brain. Basically, you're making your brain more echoey so that harmonic patterns can actually arise and be sustained in your brain. And in this sense, like music is kind of like some way of fooling the boredom mechanism in the brain so that it's introducing interesting symmetries. Now, the cool thing about this is that it's ultimately a testable theory, and we've been working out very hard on like finding precise ways of testing this. And one kind of like low-hanging fruit, which we suspect may account a very large percentage of differences in happiness, differences in valence, is that basically valence can be approximated by consonance, dissonance, and noise in any given brain state. And I'll explain further what I mean by that. So, for example, imagine that you play a pure one piano key, just one piano key. How does that sound? Is that a dissonant, consonant, or noisy? Yeah, it's consonant. It's just like it produces an emotional feel to it, and it's kind of like this very pure sound, as opposed to, for example, nails scratching a blackboard. Okay, that's a very dissonant stimuli, and it's basically dissonant stimuli have to do with basically how close the various frequencies are, and I'm gonna go into that in a couple slides. And finally, waves crashing on the ocean. For the most part, you may think that they are kind of like very soothing, and they are soothing. However, the main component of the sound of waves crashing in the ocean is noise. It's something it's a little bit like white noise. It's on its own pretty neutral stimuli, but if you're in some stressed out state of consciousness, it can be very helpful. It basically would destroy a little bit the dissonance that is going on in your brain. Okay, so how do we go about measuring bliss if our theory is true? So the answer to that would be find the ways to measure consonance, dissonance, and noise. And this would be basically a way of testing the symmetry theory of valence. And here is where like cutting-edge neuroscience and advancements in neuroimaging really become extremely relevant. I was at the Psychedelic Science Conference very recently, and I saw this amazing talk by Selen Atasoy and a few others that are basically starting to map out the various harmonics in the brain. So let me explain what that is. They call it the connectum-specific harmonics. The whole point is that you can't really easily measure them for each person because the precise shape of every person's brain is different. So what will actually resonate or echo in a given brain will have a different shape. So you actually need to put people in high-powered fMRIs, measure the structure of the white matter tracks, the gray matter tracks, and then actually simulate excitation and inhibition waves propagating in that brain and see which ones actually end up echoing. And I think like a wonderful analogy of this kind of analysis is the Chladni plates. So this is, in case you don't know, it's like just a very simple metallic plate, and you have like some way of resonating it with maybe a speaker or some other thing that is resonating, introducing a given frequency. And the thing to note is two things. On the one hand, if you take a given frequency range, say from 100 to 1,000 hertz, what you will realize is that as you increase the frequency of your vibration, it's not that you will get a different pattern for each frequency specifically, but there's going to be a discrete kind of step function. You will go from one of these beautiful patterns into another, and there's going to be a phase transition in some critical periods. And the point is that there's only so many possible ways in which it can arrange into these beautiful patterns. And the reason why is because the plate is going up and down, and going up and down, it's happening at a certain speed. And the particular sand patterns that you do see are those where the wave is actually wrapping around the object an integer number of times. And that's why it creates these beautiful symmetrical structures. The other thing to point out is that even if you don't have the right frequency, if you still add the energy to the plate, you will still probably see a pattern unless you're really, really close to the transition state, to the phase transition. And the thing that's going on there is that you don't actually need to hit the precise frequency. The plate will arrive itself to its own resonant frequency. So there's some robustness to this. And yes, Selen Atasoy and others from her lab and elsewhere in the world are basically exploring this paradigm where they identify states of consciousness as some kind of weighted sum of different brain harmonics. Now, okay, it sounds like kind of too theoretical maybe to talk about like Chladni states, like show me a brain that's resonating. Okay, so here's the various simulations that they use to kind of like show what those look like. Going from top to bottom is kind of like the main like I think these are like sampling from like the first 20 harmonics that they get, and as you see, the further up they are, the bigger the chunks that are kind of like either excited and inhibited are on any given point in time. And now let's actually see this in action. To the very left, you see kind of a low harmonic of the brain, low frequency harmonic in the brain. You have like this propagating wave of excitation and inhibition. And it's like wrapping around itself. Eventually, the whole thing repeats. I didn't make the GIFs right to it actually like loop perfectly, but it should be able to. As you go from left to right, you will see that it actually looks like it's going a lot faster, and you have like kind of like this higher frequency. If you focus on any given point in the brain, you will see that it's going on and off at a higher frequency. But that actually seems to be some sort of an illusion because the traveling wave is going at the same speed. But what's different is the number of times in which it's wrapping around itself in the brain. So even though the equation for the traveling wave is the same, that still can create like all of these different frequencies in the brain. I think these are just like the different solutions to it. So it's very similar to this. Yep. So those are simulations. Yeah, these are simulations. Yes. So actually, the whole pipeline is they put a person on an fMRI without any task. They model the structure of the brain. Then they go back to a computer and they make these simulations so that they estimate where in the brain you would be able to measure which harmonics. And then you put the person back in an fMRI, and then you can say at a given point in time how much of each of these harmonics the person is experiencing on any given point in time. And here's where we come in. Basically, kind of informed, I'll take questions at the end. Informed through kind of the symmetry theory of valence, how can we apply these like cutting edge research to basically quantify mood, quantify happiness and suffering? And we postulate, based on the symmetry theory of valence, that a mood is the result of the interactions between the various harmonic states on any given person's brain on any given point in time. So let's say they do the harmonic decomposition of your brain activity, and you find, hey, I have a 15.5% of the lowest harmonic, a 99% activation of the second harmonic, and so on. How do I transform that into a kind of valence score where I know how much I'm suffering, how much I'm experiencing pleasure, and how much I'm experiencing neutral feelings? Okay, so here's kind of the big reveal. how to actually make that. The main trick is going to be to find a way to measure the consonance, the dissonance, and the noise of the like weighted sum of all of these harmonics happening at once. And to do that, I need to explain first how to compute dissonance. So dissonance, it's pretty well studied, at least in auditory experiences, where if you played two pure tones that are like very close to each other, they feel really bad. So if you kind of like, this also works in, if you play a piano key, for example, if you play another one that is really, really nearby, it's gonna sound rough and dissonant. There's kind of like a window. If it's like sufficiently close, you don't notice that there's a dissonance, but there's like definitely a big chunk where you have a lot of like, rough dissonance. And if the frequencies are sufficiently far apart, eventually you don't notice this like dissonance between them, and you can call that a consonant. So likewise, we propose that we can do something like that with the brain. You take all the various harmonics of a person's state of consciousness. You look at those that are very close to each other, and you will say that, okay, those are very likely going to be dissonant. And you may use like an equation like this to actually say exactly how dissonant is going to be. And then there's like some issue about actually kind of renormalizing or taking into account like the actual weights. But those are technical details. We can, if you're interested, we can talk about it after the talk. There's one slight complication that I think is still worth talking about, which is actually this equation is kind of an approximation. Really, it looks more like this. And the reason is that once you get to an octave in difference, the sine waves will actually fit an integer number of times in the previous one. So it's going to be harmonic again. So you have like this very, very sudden drop in dissonance. And this is also more or less true for rational proportions with small denominators. But yeah, basically, we would just use like something like this. But this, I think, is like a good enough approximation that we would probably already get good results with that. So the algorithm basically has 4 steps. Number 1 is decompose the state into its harmonics. And by doing that, you're going to be subtracting some noise. Then second step is you denoise the harmonics further. And basically, you will take the entire superposition of all of them and apply a denoising. You could say a denoising filter, but it really it's going to have to be calibrated to the brain. Then you compute the amount of dissonance, and to do that, you take every possible pair of the harmonics that are instantiated in a given state of consciousness, and you compute the amount of dissonance for each of those pairs. And then what remains is going to be consonance between them. So let's say we apply these to like people in different states of consciousness. I would predict that we will see something like this. A person who is like, okay, feeling good, but let's say like leaning towards like neutral, let's say like okay or blah. Here is kind of like the network of how the harmonics are interfering with each other, either in terms of dissonance or consonance. The circles represent basically the loading, like how much of an activity each of these brain states have. And this is what we call the CDNS of a brain, basically the consonance, dissonance, noise signature of a brain. So the further this dot basically represents how much you have of each of those. So if you're like really up here, it's kind of like a very noisy experience. Up here would be very dissonant experience, and over here would be a very consonant experience. Now, you notice also these lines, and those represent the kind of like the spectrum of each of these things. So it's not the same if you're experiencing dissonance in low frequencies than if you're experiencing dissonance in high frequencies. So this may actually explain some of the differences, these subtle differences between emotion, that maybe you share the same valence and arousal, but the texture is different. And we think like the texture has to do with the spectrum of dissonance and consonance and noise. This is, let's say you had a wonderful meditation retreat, or really blissful orgasm, or let's say MDMA, or something that really kind of like tunes your brain into some hyperharmonic state. And we predict you would see something like this. So most of the loading would be on the harmonic component. And yes, like states of suffering and states of high pain or anxiety might look something like this. We would predict that actually, the particular pattern of the spectrum of the dissonant component would be able to distinguish between, say, like anxiety or depression or nausea or any of the other negative states. And now to like precise testable predictions. We predict that if you do this analysis and you put somebody in an fMRI and you give them a psychedelic, what you will see is that they will have more consonance, they will have more dissonance, and less noise. And the effect of that is going to be like criticality or chaos, which is something that you observe. If you put a person on SSRIs or antidepressants on an fMRI, you will see more noise, less consonance, and less dissonance. If you put a person on MDMA on an fMRI, we predict that you will see an increase of a special set of harmonics, such that they will be highly consonant. So it's less about just increasing the power on the harmonics and more about which combinations of them you're getting. So like some other drugs that are like similar but not as good, like you might argue like MDA or 5-APB, may create a similar pattern but just are not hitting exactly the same harmonics that create these hyperconsonants. Then stimulants, we would predict, cross a high-frequency consonant states. Opioids create low-frequency consonants. And just like a couple further predictions are that differences between the positive emotions will be more easily accounted by the differences in the consonant component and the analogous for the other three. This is how I envision the future of mental health, basically. So right now, if you go to a doctor's office or psychiatrist and you say, hey, I experience a lot of anxiety or anger issues, they might give you an SSRI. We explain an SSRI, its effects, in terms of blunting. It's basically just adding noise. It is doing something to these harmonics, but it's not very like personalized or very helpful for a lot of people, and it comes at the expense of just not having the ability to feel really good. Instead, I imagine that, let's say in 2050, you have some problem. You say, I have a weird negative experience. I can't describe it to people. People suggest I take a hot bath or whatever. It just doesn't help. You go into the doctor's office, they put you through an fMRI, and they say, oh, okay, yes, your CDNS says that your 17th harmonic and your 19th harmonic are highly dissonant with each other. So we recommend you take this super obscure nootropic, let's say coloracetam, because it reduces the power of the 19th harmonic. And like maybe that's something that if you take it, and most people take it, they don't feel absolutely anything. But you specifically right now, if you take it, it's gonna be wonderful because it's gonna get rid of that very precise dissonance. And yeah, just the last two slides is like kind of like this explains to a large extent like the overall effects of like SSRIs because they create this terrible thing that like any hedonic state is really hard. Like crying is hard, orgasm is infrequent and low quality, excitement comes and goes, and it's very common expression, sadness turns into mush. And music sounds uninteresting and flat. So it's like something that's supposedly going to make you feel good, but in reality it just like destroys any kind of echo or structure in your consciousness. And yeah, the explanation is that there's more noise. It's just like a noise, like it's just noising your brain. That's it. And then on psychedelics, yes, increased range of emotion, more intense, deeply felt positive mood, more intense negative emotions too. Music sounds very deep and profound. And there's like this thing that people describe as like echoing and looping of thoughts and sensations and feelings and things that snap into symmetry. And yes, we would explain that in terms of psychedelics are like neuroacoustic enhancers, basically are purifying these harmonic states in your brain. And hence, like, yeah, more intense bliss, but also potentially more intense dissonance. These are just some GIFs that I made to kind of illustrate one of the core effects of psychedelics, which is tracing, and kind of like really shows like this echoing property of psychedelics. Like if you move your hand around, you will see several copies laying behind and just like looping through all of those. And all of that's kind of like the signature of harmonics. This one is really interesting. Basically, the lowering of the symmetry detection threshold, which I've written a lot about in Qualia computing. Very prominent effect on psychedelics. You look at any texture and you will see it will start tessellate. You will see mirror symmetries in it. You will see rotational symmetries. And all of a sudden, your visual field is just this perfectly symmetrical thing. And it's like, how did that happen? And here's another example of it. And if you're really careful, you will see actually that the symmetries are different. They're slightly different. And in fact, it's been documented that you can experience any of the mathematically allowed symmetries on psychedelics. At least in 2 dimensions, there's 17. They're called the wallpaper groups. And we have reports of every single one of them. So psychedelics increase the experience of symmetry in arbitrary sense. Any mathematically allowed symmetry, your brain can generate it on psychedelic states. And yeah, some psychedelic art, again, signatures of symmetry and harmony. And yeah, to conclude, I really hope that basically having an understanding of valence, especially, again, like the first component, what makes an experience feel good, will allow us to create a society that has like, it's kind of like what I call a harmonic society. It's based on knowing what makes people feel good and bad at a very deep level, so that we can, in a sense, be able to relate with everybody very, very easily. Their pleasures and their fetishes and the things they find beautiful is not going to be as alien anymore because it's whatever tunes their brain into these blissful harmonic states. And what tunes your brain might be different than what tunes other people's brains because everybody's brains are slightly different. So we will kind of be more empathetic with others as well as more empathetic with non-human animals. They're also just pursuing harmony. And the kind of like picture I want to leave you with is that in this account, pleasure is not just like this, I don't know, pointless thing. It's actually everybody's brain is some kind of orchestra. And trying to get to a blissful state is kind of trying to get an orchestra to play a blissful symphony. So, yeah. And I think I just want to give a shout out to, other members of the Qualia Research Institute who've, conversation has definitely helped a lot with all of these. And I look forward to actually conduct the experiments and share the results with everybody. Cool.
Nice work. Really, I mean, phenomenal stuff. Thank you so much for being here, for the download, and for keeping perfectly on time. That's just like nailed it. So before we open it up broadly, just a couple kind of big picture questions that are probably on a lot of people's minds that we'll just knock off the top here. So, Andrés, I haven't seen this model of consciousness and altered states, harmony before. I know you've been to some interesting places. Can you talk a little bit about the space that this work came from inside of you? What's the personal origin of your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's through, like teenage depression states, like kind of like really thinking like, I mean, maybe we're just being stupid about like understanding happiness and pleasure and sadness. Like there might be something relatively simple and very practical that we could actually do to help everybody. I just felt like, yeah, it kind of like really motivated my going into that. Definitely like meditation has helped a lot in kind of like seeing the tuning of consciousness and kind of noticing the various harmonics. And at first having like absolutely no idea about like what's going on in my brain or like, is anybody actually like talking about in those terms? You look at lots of literature with respect to that, and you see some things that are kind of elusive, and but still kind of like approaching that kind of like, oh, it's stroke a chord inside of me, or like that deeply resonates with me, or like it rings a bell, and all of these expressions that kind of like point at something like that. And I think over the period of time, I started. Well, I must say that a very key component was talking with Mike Johnson, which is one of the people in the picture, who kind of like through conversations with him, the idea of, hey, this may actually be like thoroughly measurable. It's not just like something that will remain in kind of just like something you can talk about, but it's something you might actually be able to quantify. So I think he was like key as well in that space.
Cool, thank you. I guess one final question before we open it up here. Just on that point about quantification, and I want to kind of dig in there a little bit. We have this idea, and the Buddhists will tell you that the nature of mind is already there. You just need to strip away the obscurations, polish the mirror, so to speak, right? And I think that model is entirely consistent here. So I wonder, from whatever kind of worldview you want to speak from, what are the next steps in your research in terms of quantifying these interventions? And also, what do you see as the most effective delivery mechanisms for implementing the research? Yes, psychedelics, smart drugs, there's the molecular level, but do you see other pathways that these sort of interventions could be delivered through?
Yes. Okay. So first, quantification. I'm undergoing talks with some people in several labs who may actually have access to these technologies to do the experiment. And if anybody knows anybody with access to an fMRI, I would definitely be very interested in talking to you guys. But yes, with regards to kind of like its congruence with like some Buddhist accounts of enlightenment and bliss, I think there's a lot to say in here. If you notice, at the very end, it's kind of what remains is consonant. It's you're kind of like stripping away the noise and the dissonance, and what remains is actually just consonant. So in some sense, you might say that the base level of consciousness is very blissful, and it's just like this unfortunate looping echoes that create like the dissonance and the noise. And it's just very weird that the pure nature of consciousness may be blissful itself. And what was the last thing you mentioned?
Delivery mechanism.
Oh yes, yes. Well, I think like I'm agnostic about what's going to be the most effective. Again, like as I said, like I just touched on like how to quantify whether an experience feels good, and what remains is like, does it make you ethical? So, for example, there's very, very different talking about something like MDMA versus methamphetamine. I mean, meth makes you very selfish and self-centered. It can feel really wonderful, and I'm sure like you would find the consonance in there. But MDMA also makes you pro-social and care about others. It's just as kind of like two paradigmatic examples of good feelings that have very different social implications. And I really want to incorporate also those things. Like, does it make you productive? Does it help you with your values? And does it make you a better person? Yeah.
Sure. There's also this whole Brave New World, Aldous Huxley question, are we just going to be drunk on our own machines? So first audience question, we have an eager person there.
Given how much you've thought about this, what are the ethical implications of using a smart drug or target directing a particular psychedelic to shift the brain in a way that it changes its physiological expression, like you've been talking about? If we assume that physiological expression has an interior phenomenological correlate of an emotion or a mental model or some state of consciousness that's essentially creating that brain state. And just to reveal kind of my assumption here is that we're graced with whatever emotion is arising through an as us or a mental model as part of a soul's developmental process. And that my concern would be that by too rapidly blissing out our brain, we actually risk the developmental potential of facing a non-blissful reality. I'm just curious, since you've been playing in this space a while, what arises?
Yes, no, it's a wonderful question, and I think very important to address. I pointed out that there's like 3 components to how valuable an experience is, and how good it feels is only one of them. Also, like there's the kind of like wisdom and ethical component of it, and productivity as well, how well it can help you enact your values. With regards to, yes, like some learning process for the soul, I'm agnostic about this kind of metaphysics, but I'm open to them. And I would love to have frameworks for studying them empirically. And for sure, if it turns out that there's like some developmental process for some kind of higher being, we should probably optimize for that rather than optimize for happiness and pleasure. So, but that's like something that I think we need to find out, kind of. I recognize people have very strong intuitions about this. But yeah, my general approach is I do suspect, even in those frameworks, that maybe 90% of suffering in the world is probably unnecessary and it's unredeeming. A lot of it just doesn't amount to much in the end. I mean, I almost think of it as some kind of like Stockholm syndrome. For people who've been suffering for a long time, they just kind of like have to find a very strong meaning to it. And I think they could have achieved great learnings with it, but I think maybe those learnings could have been achieved with maybe 5% of that suffering. So in that sense, yes, that's important. And one more thing is that if, for example, the Buddhist ontology of the many worlds in the universe is correct, I recognize that understanding how to create pure bliss in a technological way would transform our world into some kind of Deva or a Shura world rather than a pure land where you learn to wake up. And that would be a terrible danger, I recognize. We don't want to just be blissed out and forget about learning about consciousness and the nature of suffering more deeply. But again, my approach here would be, let's keep our minds open to all of these possibilities and find ways of testing if there's any one of them that has more predictive ability.
So in your kind of speculative future of applying this in, sort of harmonic brain, brain retuning, harmonic brain retuning, you mentioned you only mentioned one. I know you were rushed at this point, and you mentioned one way of treating, brain dissonance might be some sort of chemical thing. Have you thought about using music, or more specifically mantras, which is kind of what they're designed for? Have you actually experimented on that, or are you aware of any research into the effects of mantras on brain harmonics?
I'm not aware of any research on mantras and brain harmonics, but I imagine they probably have like a strong effect. My guess here is that if you can figure out what is the actual like texture or like pattern of dissonance for a given person, you might be able to select out of like, let's say 1,000 mantras, the one that will work the best for that person. It might be, I think like I'm still kind of like very agnostic about which is going to be the best methods. And it could be that something as simple as a mantra is like all you need. And maybe we really don't need any chemicals. I'm open to that possibility. So, but I suspect even then the kind of like having this framework for like studying exactly where the problem of the dissonance is would basically accelerate the process of healing through those technologies. Yeah.
So simply you're talking about having a state of symmetry, and what about people's capacity to enjoy symmetry? Is that we can have a symmetry, but what is our capacity? Is that measurable, or what do you think about that?
Yes, so really you have to think of it in terms of the combination of your state and of the input. So there's like some states of consciousness where a special kind of music will feel really, really awful, even though for a lot of people it might feel really, really good. And I think it has to do with whether the music is really hitting at the neuroacoustics of your brain at that particular point in time. I mean, the music that feels the best on when you're very relaxed is very different than the music that feels the best when you're like very excited. And likewise, being able to appreciate some forms of symmetry has to do a lot with that. Like basically what is kind of the underlying harmonics that are present in your brain on any given point in time, such that when you introduce the symmetrical stimuli, you actually get a response. And paradoxically, we actually would predict that very symmetrical stimuli would also produce the worst reactions in people who are already in a very symmetrical state that is incompatible with that input. So to give an example, if you're like very deep in meditation, some particular state of consciousness, and you play the wrong tone, you may feel really, really awful. Maybe that tone is exactly hitting the dissonance window. And if you hit a tone that is just slightly below it, it may feel great. So kind of like being able to appreciate some symmetrical or harmonic input has to do with your pre-existing harmonics. I will just add to that the actual geometry of consciousness, and this is another area of my research, the whole geometry of your consciousness may also change to the point that, for example, on DMT, the things that resonate are not actually Euclidean harmonics, they may be hyperbolic harmonics. So some other states of consciousness, what stimuli actually makes you feel good may be really alien, may look really, really weird.
I just had a question, because you've been talking a lot about sound. Have you explored, there's the 9 solfeggio frequencies, like the 528, the 432 are some of the most common ones, and it's a very, very specific tone on the harmonic scale, and when it's played, it actually creates a brain entrainment. And like 528 is said to actually, when it's played, it can actually heal DNA and cellular, things. And so each of the keys, because we're going short here, I'm not going to go into a whole thing about it, but basically, I'm curious if that's something that you guys have explored, because this very specific tones in the Hertz frequency. So it's like 528, 432. There's 9 of them that were studied by like ancient monks, and they go back to the Egyptians, and like there's this whole ancient civilization piece with these particular tones. And has that been something that you guys have explored?
I definitely believe it. You can have a very strong psychological, like very intense effect from all of these pure tones. I would imagine within this framework, the way you might explain that is you're getting really at kind of like the most resonant frequencies possible. And as you said, like, brain entrainment is kind of in the Chladni plates that, I mean, you can kind of like get away with not getting the right frequency because the plate itself will like arrive at its own natural resonance. But if you get the actual exact frequency, you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck. So I would imagine if there's like some pure tones that like really, really feel really good and have the effects you describe, that might be precisely because they're like the most kind of like direct way of getting at some of these pure harmonics.
What's the current state of mapping the neural correlates of emotion and the current state of creating a quantified scale of valence, and why is this model an improvement on both of those?
Yes. So the current state would go something as follows. You put people on fMRI machines and arguably also things such as EEGs. Then you run a very complex machine learning algorithm. Throughout the experiment, you sample people's moods, and then you basically apply the machine learning algorithm to find the best classifier to get there. And the paper might look something like, hey, we found that this particular cluster of voxels correlate very highly with sadness and so on. I think that's really good information. But it really, I mean, if you take people who have like brains that are like look pretty different, the clusters of voxels that will actually work will be pretty far apart. And you don't really have like a theory to explain why is that? Why is it the case that in this person, this part of the brain causes this effect, and in this other person is this other part of the brain? So the improvement here is actually coming up with a theory from first principles that basically tells you why you would expect these differences. And having a theory is, I mean, I would say it's a tremendous improvement. I mean, I recognize it could be falsified. All of this could be completely wrong, but at least it's making testable predictions. And if it turns out to be true, it would also allow us to basically engineer changes to the brain that would produce results that are completely outside of the range of things we have thought of, that would produce extremely, extremely pure and intense emotions that may be completely alien, that someday in the future we might recruit for. daily activities or whatnot. But I think like there's tremendous value in actually having a theory to explain why.